Henry Kissinger is the latest in a string of high-profile American visitors to Beijing. What does this mean for China-U.S. relations? Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. In a flurry of diplomatic activity, current and former U.S. government officials have traveled to China. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger just met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Almost 52 years ago, Kissinger helped lay the foundation for the normalization of Sino-U.S. ties. In June, the current U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, held talks with President Xi on how to ease tensions between the two nations. Earlier this month, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen had meetings with her Beijing counterparts on the economic challenges ahead. And earlier this week, U.S. climate envoy John Kerry discussed critical climate change issues with top Chinese officials, a resumption of communication between the two countries that had been suspended since last August. So what do these visits mean, and are relations between China and the United States headed in the right direction? To discuss this and much more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Pennsylvania, Anthony Moretti is an associate professor at Robert Morris University. In Xi'an, Yan Liang is chair professor of economics at Willamette University. Out of Miami, James P. Moore is the founder and CEO of the Washington Institute for Business, Government, and Society. And in Beijing, Victor Gao is chair professor at Soochow University. I want to welcome all of you to the show, and I'd like to start with you, Victor. I know you've met Henry Kissinger. He laid the foundation for this relationship between the United States and China so many years ago, 52 years ago. And, you know, President Xi called him an old friend on this recent visit. Kind of set the stage for us. How significant is this visit?
Thank you very much for having me. I think China, the Chinese government, the leaders and the people were all very happy to see Dr. Henry Kissinger back in Beijing when he is already 100 years, and this was his 100th visit, if not more plus. And he's a great friend, and he's a household name, and he really opened the door to defreezing China-U.S. relations starting in 1971, and no one in the United States or no one in the world knows China better than Dr. Henry Kissinger. And history has proven that Dr. Henry Kissinger has really understood China and the United States and the relations between the two countries, and how important that peace should be the dominant thing between these two countries than possibly anyone in the world, historically speaking, or this is the background. And I think what he discussed with the Chinese leaders will be of great importance, because as a rule of thumb, every time Dr. Henry Kissinger goes back to the United States after making a visit to China, he will prepare a very detailed memo to the incumbent president, in this case President Biden, for his review, containing a summary, observations, and recommendations about key issues in China-U.S. relations. This visit will be no exception, and I think his memorandum will be of great importance, helping stabilizing the relations between these two countries and possibly paving the way for more constructive and more normal development in China-U.S. relations going forward.
Anthony, it's interesting. I was at an event earlier this year, and Dr. Kissinger couldn't be there, but he relayed a message on videotape. I think it was about 8-10 minutes long. You could hear a pin drop in this ballroom. I mean, it was all these people who have their eyes set on U.S.-China relations. They were listening to every word from him. So to you know, Victor's point, obviously the U.S. government will be interested in his insights, although the U.S. State Department is saying he's not representing the U.S. government on this trip. He's going of his own volition. But, you know, the optics kind of tell a different story. He meets with President Xi. He met with Defense Minister Li Shangfu, the top diplomat Wang Yi. And the BBC reported that Wang stated that the U.S.-China policy needs Kissinger's diplomatic wisdom and Nixon's political courage. I want to get your thoughts on that statement.
I think that statement makes a lot of sense on a couple of levels. Number one, as Victor suggested, there is nobody in the United States who understands the depth and the complexity of U.S.-Chinese relations that he does. And I also think there's something sad about this, and or disappointing is maybe a better word. And this is not a criticism of Dr. Kissinger in any way, but the fact that the United States needs a 100-year-old man to get its relations with China moving forward in a positive direction suggests a couple of things, at least as I see it. Number one, either there's not been a, for lack of a better phrase, grooming of enough diplomats or enough students of history to understand the complexity of this relationship, or, and this is perhaps the more correct or the more likely answer, there is such an ingrained hostility toward China at this point that for Dr. Kissinger to go on his own volition in an unofficial visit, the air quotes that I'm providing there are not done to be flippant. I think they're done as a demonstration that, look, he's somebody who's going to be respected. He's somebody who's going to be listened to. But on top of that, quite frankly, we, meaning the United States, we need him there. And that is that's a little bit uncomfortable to recognize that a 100-year-old man is still that necessary. And again, I'm not criticizing him in any way when I say that.
Right. Yan Liang, normally we talk to you in the Northwest in Oregon, where it always seems to be raining. We're talking to you now in Xi'an. So you've got one foot in each of these countries in a sense. I want to get your thoughts on this comment, diplomatic wisdom, political courage, because there's two pieces to that, of course, and I think the political courage is actually the more important element of this, because it seems, to Anthony's point, either left or right, there's so much hostility towards China right now that it is going to take a certain amount of courage to try and reestablish relations. It's not the easier pathway for the Biden administration, given the way things are here in Washington, D.C. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely, Mike. Good to talk to you. But I think, what China and the United States seem to be doing is really trying to open up channels of communications. Kissinger is not the only one who came to China in the recent weeks and months. So we have already the State Secretary Blinken, we have the Treasury Secretary Yellen, who have already come, and also the environmental, the climate talks were also going on. So I think this is the way that both countries do really value the relationships, although maybe both have different goals. For the United States, they want to guardrail the relationships, preventing the competition from eroding into some sort of conflict. But for China, the goal has always been clear. China appreciates the kinds of mutual cooperation and respect. But I think in any ways, I think it's a good sign that both countries open up these, different channels, official and unofficial, including Kissinger and, business people like, for example, Bill Gates. So I think all these show the two countries really are connected in many, many areas, including economic, diplomatic and political and, businesses. So I think this is a good sign that both countries open up more channels of communications. And of course, China really appreciate the people who understand China and can bring positive messages back to China. As President Xi Jinping said, right, we really need to have more constructive sort of insights and to trying to put this relationship back to the normal track.
And Yan Liang, we're talking about talks, the importance of talks, but obviously the other T word is tension, and there's a lot of that between these two countries. I mean, Taiwan, tariffs, sanctions, now about these material for manufacturing chips, for new technologies. Those are not going to be easy things to remedy. Where do you see that going? And obviously it doesn't just impact these two countries, it impacts the globe in a sense.
Absolutely. So I think really the key is to depoliticize some of these economic relationships. I think for businesses, when the Biden administration talking about de-risking, I think what the business community really wants is stable political relationships and very clear and transparent policy making at the political and policy making circle. So then they would be able to manage risks. And so I think you're right. Both countries need each other. Both are the biggest economies in the world. They have vibrant trade investment relationships. But Biden administration's recent efforts, right, in some ways containing China's economic development, I think that is really a worrying sign. But I think, again, for the overall economic and business relationships and for the rest of the world, it's very important for some of these economic relationships to return to sort of to the market, right, instead of being politicized.
Yeah. James, you've also met Kissinger. I mean, he really understands the culture and the people of China. Obviously, he's been going there, as Victor pointed out, at least 100 times. He has this legacy of creating a constructive and beneficial relationship for both countries. And it seems that China has a preference to kind of return to that venue, that kind of engagement. Al Jazeera reported that Defense Minister Li said in a release that basically the reason for the downfall in China-U.S. relations is because of, quote, some people on the American side who are not willing to meet China halfway. Do you see this kind of chipping away at that, where, you know, at least there's dialogue and perhaps they can find some kind of way to meet in the middle?
Absolutely. You know, I think we have to put an awful lot of things in perspective. When Dr. Kissinger first was involved in opening up China as a result of really the intermediary, Nicolae Ceausescu at the time was the leader of Romania, it was a very different period. Joseph Biden had been a United States Senator for 2 years. The relationship, certainly as far as trade was concerned, was absolutely minuscule back then. And things have developed in such a way that China has come a very long way in regards to, and the United States, in regards to the two-way relationship. Today, we're dealing with issues that we never would have dreamt about back in 1974. The need for addressing climate change, dealing with a subject like chips electronically. These are all dramatic changes, and the evolution has been absolutely extraordinary. But the notion of stopping dialogue between the two superpowers of the world today is really infantile. It is something that needs to continue to be worked at. Clearly, the incident over the Chinese balloon was a significant moment in which it all of a sudden put a blockade in terms of the discussions between the United States and China. But sometimes I think even with two nations, whether it's China and the United States or smaller nations, sometimes we need adult supervision to be able to say, look, there's an awful lot that's at stake here, and we have got, at the very least, to be able to talk with one another. You just mentioned, for example, the defense minister. Well, the United States, of course, imposed, when Donald Trump was president of the United States, sanctions against him for a variety of reasons. And so there are a lot of these kind of ticklish issues that have got to be addressed. And the best way to do it is obviously through dialogue. Delighted that Janet Yellen was there, John Kerry was there, Antony Blinken was there. This is a start, and I think can only add to a much more positive relationship between our two countries.
And Victor, President Xi said there are 3 principles that will go a long way in restoring these ties: mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation. And we've seen these visits. When you were in the States not long ago, we had a chance to chat, and we talked about Bali and Biden and Xi meeting, and you said it was a breakthrough in the sense that both of these men sat down and talked to each other as equals. There's none of this lecturing or any of that. Are you seeing this as kind of an outgrowth of that, and how encouraged are you?
Well, personally, I'm very much encouraged because even though Secretary of State Antony Blinken recently made a visit to China in June, his visit should have happened in February, as arranged by the two presidents of China and the United States. The balloon incident really disrupted this. However, as the United States now acknowledge, the balloon, as China had clarified from the very beginning, was not an espionage device. It was on a routine mission on weather investigation, for example. And hopefully, when the dust settled, the United States should become more rational in dealing with these things, force majeure caused, for example, blowing out of course, and hopefully China and the United States can re-engage with each other. Now, the fundamental thing I think that Dr. Henry Kissinger can bring to the table is his conviction that war should not be an option between China and the United States. And China and the United States can only deal with each other in peace, despite of our differences. This is also exactly the point you just now mentioned that the Chinese President Xi Jinping outlined in his meeting with Dr. Henry Kissinger. And I think when President Xi Jinping met with Dr. Henry Kissinger, it was also a very touching moment because he arranged a lunch in honor of Dr. Henry Kissinger in the same villa that Dr. Henry Kissinger came back in 1971 on the secret visit. And some of the courses in the on the menu were the same that was served to Dr. Henry Kissinger back in 1971. And President Xi Jinping emphasized that China never forgets an old friend. And what a good old friend that Dr. Henry Kissinger has been to China and the Chinese people. And whatever he helped unleash in 1971, 1972, all the way up to 1979, for example, really changed both China and the United States and changed the world for the better. This should give hope to everyone in the United States that China should not and is not an enemy of the United States. And the only way to deal with China-U.S. relations is to live and let live. That is to get along with each other despite of our differences. And the two countries, the two largest economies, one of the two largest militaries in the world, can really help each other to stabilize the global situation and deal with all these global challenges, and also to make sure that both China and the United States benefit and continue to benefit from continued engagement with each other rather than falling out from each other or even getting at each other's jugular. Now, Dr. Henry Kissinger has been persistent and consistent in urging that war should not be considered between China and the United States because it will really lead to disaster of both China and the United States. And I think all of us in China as well as in the United States need to listen very carefully what Dr. Henry Kissinger has to say. And his words are really of great wisdom and can be of great benefit to both China and the United States and the world at large.
And Victor, let me just ask a follow-up on this, because you and I have both made this trek flying from the U.S. to China and vice versa. It can take the wind out of your sails, and you deal with jet lag. And the thought of doing that at the age of 100 years old, I mean, to me, it's mind-boggling that he can pull it off. But it also says something about legacy. I mean, here's a man who this is his living legacy, what he has done, what he's created, this relationship. And undoubtedly, he has to have fears that it's fizzling and going in the wrong direction. Can you talk about the motivation for making this trip on his behalf?
Yes, indeed. I think one thing that Dr. Henry Kissinger said when he was in China, meeting with the Chinese leaders, was exactly this. He said, about 52 years ago, I helped opening the door between China and the United States. And now I worry about this door between China and the United States, between the Chinese people and the American people, will be closed. And what will be the consequences of closing the door between China and the United States, the two largest economies of the world? I think this keeps Dr. Henry Kissinger constantly on the worry about what should not be done, what should be done between China and the United States, and what will be the maximum worst case, what will be the maximum best case, and what will be the achievable pragmatic scenario in between these two extremes. And I think he is the person in the United States and in the Western world at large who has really brought about all the philosophical thinking about this, and he has the intellectual bandwidth, as well the depth and the breadth to think about all these issues. And he is not really very much buried in the details of the day-to-day operations of the bilateral relations. He could have the luxury of looking at the long term and thinking about China and the United States, let's say around 2050 or around 2100, for example, or even about 100 years from today. Yeah. This is the intellectual bandwidth that we need in China-U.S. relations today.
And Anthony, we're talking a lot about Kissinger. Of course, there's another K that was there, Kerry. His trip somewhat eclipsed by the fact that Kissinger arrived, but he was there for 3 days to talk about climate issues. Let's listen to what he had to say.
The climate issue is not a bilateral issue in our judgment. President Biden believes, as I think most of the world does, that the climate crisis is a universal threat to humankind. And we all have a responsibility to deal with it as rapidly as we can. And we hope we will leave other issues to the side.
So when he says other issues, is that the politics, or is it just basically some of these other problems that we talked about? He wants to compartmentalize those, put them off to the side. Let's just concentrate on climate. And how's that going to go over in China?
Well, I suspect that one of the ways to look at this is that, and I accept that idea of sort of compartmentalizing certain things. Let's face it, if the climate situation is not resolved, then everything else is going to be diminished, because just the sheer urgency and the sheer crisis that already exists is only going to magnify in say 5, 10, 20 years if some of these issues are still taking place. And I think at the same time, what I think is important to remember is that climate is one of those issues that ought not be based on politics. And so I wonder if part of Mr. Kerry's message was also being delivered to Republicans back in the United States. You might remember that a few days before he flew to China, he was testifying before Congress, and a couple of Republicans were especially harsh toward him, one suggesting that scientists who believe in global warming were grifters, and John Kerry was a grifter for therefore agreeing with them, and another representative from Texas suggesting that China will and never will be a honest broker when it comes to discussing climate. This kind of rhetoric doesn't help. And so if we're arguing, well, arguing is perhaps not the right word. If all of us are in agreement that Dr. Kissinger was able to provide a sort of political maturity to these conversations about some of the political differences, then I think perhaps we also ought to give John Kerry a tip of the hat for being able to hopefully make climate change an issue that all sides agree on needs to be dealt with, and needs to be dealt with immediately. Just look at the heat waves that have taken place in the United States and Europe and Asia. These are not one-off situations. These are all signs of a growing problem. And if the U.S. and China can tackle it together, the chances for success go way up. And some American politicians need to understand that A, the crisis is real, and B, the United States, which is a contributor to the problem, has to be a contributor to the solution.
And Young, China is pledging to level off carbon dioxide emissions by 2030 and become carbon neutral by 2060. But the U.S. continues to pressure China on its climate policies, and that's kind of rankled leaders in China. President Xi even commenting on this. It was reported in the People's Daily newspaper. He said these policies must be determined by the country itself rather than swayed by others. Is there a way, I mean, this kind of gets back to this whole mutual respect discussion that we had earlier. Is there a way to have these kind of conversations, these thorny issues, where you can do it in a respectful manner?
Absolutely. I think, different countries have their own economic and social realities, and also the technological sort of constraints and capabilities. So I definitely think these decisions need to be made at the country's level, even though I do agree that countries should cooperate together. But the difficulty, I think, at this point to compartmentalize this sort of climate cooperation is that sort of the deep distrust between each other. I think if the United States does not trust China as a partner, or China does not believe that the U.S. leaves that autonomy, then I think it's very difficult for the both sides to work together. The other point, I think, is, when you look at the United States, when, Treasury Secretary talked about their 3 principles. The first thing is to protect national security. And it's very unclear what that national security is defined. And it has been expanded. It has been pretty arbitrary. So in that sense, I think it's very difficult for both countries to share certain technologies that are very essential to promote the carbon neutrality or carbon peak kind of goals. So I think this is very, at the practical level, it's difficult for both countries to cooperate on those very, enormous climate goals if they have this kind of distrust. And also, if they have all these barriers, preventing sharing these technologies and resources to overcome these climate challenges.
Yeah, James, one of the interesting things, though, is Kerry says the talks are going to continue up until the COP28 that's coming up, the summit in November. China and the U.S. obviously the largest emitters in the world, but we also know when they come together, when Xi and Obama came together, we saw the Paris Agreement moving forward, that they can actually drive the rest of the world. So it's important that these talks continue. Do you expect any kind of agreement to come out of these talks?
I certainly hope so. Do expect any dramatic result from all this? No. But certainly the notion of being able to try to work together is going to be awfully important. I mean, when we realize, for example, that Vice President Al Gore under President Clinton wrote that famous book, Indecent, I'm forgetting the title, that dealt with climate change, his predictions really now have accelerated dramatically. It was an inconvenient truth.
That's it.
And so today we're dealing with the fact that we have this heat wave, the notion that the globe has just experienced the hottest June and probably July and August as well in the history of the world has got to send some kind of a message. To the point about Dr. Kissinger's trip to Beijing, I think it's important to realize that not only were the Chinese waving the flag as far as having Dr. Kissinger come to visit, but so was the United States. Yes, he was not representing the United States, but I think the notion that he was somehow trying to heal the wounds that have been inflicted over the past few years between the United States and China were put in some kind of a perspective to be able to give a sense of what's gone for some time. But certainly climate change is going to be there is the day of reckoning, and that day of reckoning is now upon us.
All right, Victor, I'm going to give you the last word on this. We've got about a minute left. We're seeing kind of this drumbeat, meeting, and there's been a lot of speculation that perhaps the APEC meeting in November, that we might actually see Biden and Xi sitting down and talking with one another. As we talked about earlier, that was very important with Bali. Do you suspect that might actually happen?
I personally believe the summit meeting will take place on the sideline of a major international meeting. However, allow me to express my real personal wish. That is, President Biden of the United States will make a state visit to China before the end of this year, or at least before the end of his first term as the President of the United States. I believe he'll be warmly welcomed here. And in return, Chinese President Xi Jinping will also make a state visit to the United States. Now, this is what's befitting for these two largest economies in the world, and this will demonstrate to the rest of the world that China and the United States, including their top leadership, can get along with each other despite of all the differences, and they are committed to developing their relations in a peaceful way, in a cooperative way, in a constructive way, rather than allowing antagonism and rivalry to prevail in the bilateral relations.
I think you're making a great point there. Let's hope it actually happens. I want to thank our guests for this incredible discussion. Appreciate it. Have a great weekend, all four of you. We need to leave it there. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching another edition of The Heat.